Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. I would love if you would help us spread the word by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts so that other innovators like you can find us. And don't forget to check us out on YouTube as well. Well, I want to welcome Iraq to the list of the 70 plus countries listening from around the world today. My guest is Marsha Acker. Marsha is an executive and leadership team coach. She's an author, speaker, fellow facilitator, and she's the host of the Defining Moments Leadership podcast. She's the author of The Art and Science of Facilitation, How to Lead Effective Collaboration with Agile Teams and Build Your Model for Leading Change. That's coming early 2023. Super excited to talk more with you today. Welcome, Marsha.
Thank you, Natalie. And wow, 70 countries. So that's fantastic. It's a great audience.
Thank you. Yeah, we're so excited to have you and just talk a little bit about, I want to talk about a little bit about your role and what you do today. You're the
Mm.
CEO of Team Catapult. So just give us a little bit of lay of the land of what types of things you work on.
Mm. Well, we like to say at Team Catapult, we have both our vision and our passion are a world where all voices are heard and included, and we have meaningful conversations that propel us forward. I think that everything that we do as a collective is about, so much of our world is about how we gather and have conversations. And so it just feels really critical and important, and it's what propels us forward every day.
I love that. And so we are going to take some time really to
Mm.
talk about the art and science of facilitation. This is one of my favorite topics. I just did a session a few weeks ago on how to lead a fun and effective meeting. And a lot of that was about the art of facilitation. And so I want to just start by talking about the power behind facilitation. For those who are not
Mm.
convinced that they need either, facilitators or this
Yeah.
skill of facilitation in their organization. Let's talk a little bit about the why facilitation.
Yeah. Well, I think that you just hit on it because you used a word, you said convinced. And for the for the 25 years I've been practicing facilitation, I've been through various stages of feeling like I have to convince people. And here's my hypothesis about that. And I think it's about both facilitation and just basic conversation, is that I think we inherently believe that we're already good at it. And so if we feel like we're already good at, I mean, like we're communicating, right? So
Right.
you and I are gathering, we're going to talk, we're going to have a conversation, and that's communication. So why would we need someone else to come help us have a conversation, whether it's just the two of us or whether it's 20 of us gathering? And I think that's part of our thinking. And the reality is that I think we often believe we are communicating, but we're really doing something else. I think there are lots of hidden dynamics, the invisible stuff that sits underneath our conversations. And so it leaves us talking about like the shell game, that we're moving the shells around on the table versus why is the shell there? Or
Mhm.
why are we using shells? And why do you think it's a shell and I think it's a square or something? So I think there's so many ways that we talk past one another. So
Mhm.
I don't know. That's why I think it's important. What's your experience with it?
Yeah, it's so funny when you just the examples you used, right? Just the fact of like why are there shells there? Like
Mhm.
what are we really talking about? That is the crux of it. And I feel like
Yeah.
so often when we enter conversations, there's an elephant that we're all really dancing around. And I think a lot of what facilitation does is it pulls the elephant out into the middle of the room. We paint it red, and we look at the elephant and we say, "Oh, there's an elephant there." And
Mhm.
sometimes depending on what that elephant is, we may be the one who helped bring the elephant into the room. So
Mm.
we're not the best person to dissect why it's there in the first place. And so we
Yeah.
need somebody to help us in a kind and relevant way say, hey,
Mm.
there's an elephant here. And I know it, we feel it. Let's take a moment to slow the conversation down.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how it got in the room. Why is it in the room? And then what do we need to do about it? And so the beauty of facilitation is when I don't have a, if you will, dog in the fight, I can stand back and I can look at the lay of the land and say, hey, I feel like we're talking around a topic we need to talk about. And
Yeah.
that's the beauty to me of facilitation is you're cutting right to the heart of what is it we're really trying to say? What is it we're really trying to do here? And so often, things fly off in this direction and then we squirrel off in the other direction and we leave the meeting and we're like, well, what happened? And what did we talk about? And what did we decide? And that to me is the power of facilitation is that we're going to focus on a topic. We're going to talk about what needs to be talked about. And we're going to leave with action, ownership, next steps, and we're going to leave with clarity. And I think that most people don't realize how infrequently they leave meetings with clarity.
I couldn't agree more. One of the things that I love about what you said is that sometimes we're the one that brought the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Right. And we're just, unaware of it. So yeah.
Well, and I think that's the beauty of a facilitator too, is because, I even think about if you've read any of Cynthia, I think it's Cynthia Robb, she writes on zero gravity thinkers. And a lot of what her premise is the idea that like this person's not tied up in your political game, right? So every organization has some form of politics. Some have a lot, some have a little, but everybody has it. And when a facilitator comes from the outside, they're not in the political landscape. So they can look at something that everyone else is like, oh, that's there, but we don't talk about it. And be like, what is that? Why is that over there? What's that doing? And you're like, oh, we don't talk about it. No, but we can and we should.
Yeah.
And
What would it be like if we did?
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about let's do for those again who are more of our logical thinkers, let's what's the cost of not doing this? Like, what's the cost of not bringing a good facilitative? Because there's kind of the idea of having a facilitator, but then there's like the facilitative spirit, if you will, of just having good facilitation in meetings, like regardless, right? Maybe it's not always bringing somebody in, but sometimes it's like, let's just follow good facilitation principles. What's the cost when we don't do that?
Well, the cost when we don't do that, like if your listeners if you're listening, what I would say is think about over the last week, how many times you've either been in a meeting where you've had the same conversation that you had the week before, or maybe the week before that. So I look for times where I have this impulsive, it's an eye roll moment, right? Are we back here? Are we having this conversation again? So I think repeated conversations are a flag. Or then you just named the other one, which is leaving a meeting and you walk out and you go, we talked about a lot, or we feels like we covered a lot of ground. And I'm really unclear about what the decision was or what I'm supposed to do about it. And I think those are the two most common experiences. I know I certainly have. I can't sit here and say that I've never been part of leading meetings in my own company. Like, I think it's just naturally, like, you get to a topic that you care greatly about or you're passionate about. And I think it's easy to get tripped up on that. So the cost is we just keep having the same conversations. I don't think anybody is looking for more meetings on their calendar. Like, we seem to be in a, particularly since the pandemic, it just seems like everyone's calendar is really loaded with meeting after meeting after meeting. I know every team I talk to just talks about the cadence of going from one thing to the next. So I think about the cost is we keep having the same conversations. We're around and around on a topic, or we're just losing energy around it. Like feeling like I know I've been in meetings where it just, there's no, what's the word? Like it lacks any real meaning. It's like we're talking about a whole bunch of topics, but there's no substance underneath of it. It just, I go back to a shell game.
It's like a rudderless meeting.
Yes, that's a really great analogy.
Yes, and there's times too when I think about this in terms of facilitation, right? Like
Mm,
what do I need a facilitator for and what do I not? And what is a meeting and what is not? And I think that we don't talk about this in organizations, right? If the decision's already made, if it's non-complex,
mm,
if there's not a lot of discussion that can go into the decision, then it's an email. It's not
yeah,
even a meeting.
yeah.
And if it is a meeting, I like what you said. Do all voices get to be heard?
Mm,
Are you inviting all voices to the table? I've been in meetings where people were trying to throw out a decision,
mm,
and then when voices tried to collectively speak into that decision, they weren't interested in hearing that.
yeah,
Guess what? It's not a meeting, it's an email. Just
yeah.
tell us that you've made this decision, it's made, and this is the direction we're going in. And so oftentimes too, I think frustration enters when people can't define what an email
Mm,
is, what a meeting is, and then when do I really need this facilitative prowess in a meeting.
yeah.
And so talk to me about like what would you say are some of the key like high stakes,
Mm,
we got to get a facilitator for this type of thing.
mm. Do you know what? I came out of the world of professional facilitation, so it certainly has been my career. But about 10 years ago, I decided that it would be great, for every team to be able to bring in an external facilitator. But the reality is, I think every meeting needs facilitation. And so I view facilitation as a key leadership skill. Like I so want to disrupt the thinking that it needs to be, somebody who's a professional facilitator. I think that every leader, anybody can lead the meeting and facilitate it, and that some of those skills of neutrality and focusing on process, not content, when you're stepping
Mhm.
into that role can be really helpful. And then I think, to answer your question, I think that there are times where when the when you care greatly about the topic, like you really have an opinion, or it's
Mhm.
you're deciding on a really big strategy, or you notice that you've been having this conversation for the past 3 months and you don't want to have it anymore, but you can't seem to figure out how to get yourself out of it. I think those are the times where you tap somebody external to the team, with a bit more skill and training, and professional facilitators are great to to come in and help you navigate some of those higher stakes, higher
Mhm.
risk, higher topics, or the ones that you just find yourself having over and over again.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think that um, I would love for us to talk a little bit about like, what do you think are some of the key skills
Mm.
that people should look for in a facilitator when they're thinking about, selecting a facilitator, or maybe they're thinking about preparing themselves to walk in and facilitate? What would you say are like top five,
Mm.
rules for the road for facilitators?
Yeah, great. First is to be able to drop all your opinions about the subject, which I think that is probably where most leaders find themselves wanting to bail on this whole idea of being a facilitator. But I think you've got to find a way to be really clear about your bias and where you might be overly driving in one
Mhm.
particular direction. And I often say to leaders who are dual hatted, right, who have some role in the team but are also trying to facilitate, um, practice, really bringing full neutrality to that conversation. And then if you feel like you've, really authentically need to bring something in, then just demonstrate, hey, I'm going to step out of the role of facilitation right now, and I'm going to speak to you from this role. And
Mhm.
here's what I know about this, or here's what I know, and this isn't on the table for us to decide, but this is. So now I'll step back into the role of facilitation. So I think neutrality is really important. I think the other aspect, and I think any leader can do this, just with a little bit of intentionality. The first is to be really um, intentional about planning a meeting. It needs a purpose
Mhm.
and a desired outcome before you ever get in the room. And that whole piece about planning and participants who are coming to the meeting, asking them, what do you need to get out of this meeting? Like, what do
Mhm.
you need for it to be successful? What's the most important topic? I find that those people who are coming to the meeting know the hidden, you call them elephants,
Yes.
like they know what the elephants are. I think something happens when they get together that becomes a bit more scary to name it. And so doing your plan up front to invite some of that input before you get there. And then I think the third piece is having a really clear design, like a very clear arc that's outcome oriented. And both of those things happen before you get in the room. So I think sometimes facilitation is 50% about who you are and how you're showing up, and another percentage about, some of the planning and design work you do. And then I think once you get into that space, being able to engage, you and I both made the comment about being able to engage all voices. So it's got to have a design. You can't just be talking at people or letting one or two people dominate the airtime. So finding that balance of hearing different voices and different modalities and smaller groups versus larger groups. So things that mix it up.
I love these. I love these things you're saying. And one thing I want to just tease out a little bit more that you're saying, and is we need to think about the meeting in three parts. We need to think about the fact that yes, you do need to prepare for a meeting. And I would even say it like this: if we don't have the time to prepare for the meeting, we shouldn't put the meeting on the calendar. Like
Love it.
it's that important that we take that pre-work time that you're talking about to sit down and think about what role you want the people in the meeting to play, as well as what are they trying to solve by being a part of that meeting, and are you serving that as well as your own needs for setting that meeting, and then also the actual inner workings of the meeting. How are you going to run it? Like, how are you going to run the meeting, even when it may go off the rails? What are some different ways you can, again, bringing in that facilitation skill to bring things back on par, right? Is it the parking lot idea? Is it the what are different tools you're going to use to keep us on track? Hey, I know that we can get in this meeting and talk about 30 things, but I only want to talk about these 3 today because we won't get through it all. So if it's more than that, how do we make sure that we capture your needs and not just capture them so people will be quiet, but return to them later, right? We want to return to that later and say, okay, hey, you mentioned this in the meeting. That was not the purpose of the meeting, but let's set up some time to talk about this. And then follow up, right? And follow through. Like, how do you land the plane? How do you walk out with clear expectations for each person that was a part of the meeting? And how do you give them notes, right? Within 24 to 48 hours of the meeting, so everybody can look back on what we covered. And I feel like these things are so important when we think about meetings. And again, like you said, not wasting time and not having the same conversation over and over again. I've been in meetings where halfway through the meeting, people were like, what are we talking about? That's not a good meeting. That's a really bad
Or why
meeting.
are we here?
Right?
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I totally
Well,
agree.
help me understand. So I would love to hear a little bit about what happens when your meeting's gone off the rails, right? You do have that person that's taking up a lot of the oxygen. You do have people that are having side conversations. You do have just these moments where you've lost control of your meeting. How do you bring it back?
Well, I think there are many strategies. But one of the simplest ones I would offer is everything that's happening is data. And I think early on in my facilitation career, I would have said, well, I'm going to walk over to those people and I'm going to stand next to them, and that'll definitely, they'll be self-conscious about the fact they're having a conversation. I think the way I'd respond now is I just simply get curious. I go, okay, so can we just pause for a moment? So I'm like, my sense is it's gotten really quiet in here, and I'm wondering what's going on for you. So can we just talk about what's happening, here in the moment? Or, somebody raises an objection and says, I'm not doing this anymore. This is ridiculous. I just hit the process pause. This is my sign for the process pause. And I just say, that's fantastic. Thank you for saying that. And I go back to the group again. So can I just ask what's happening here? So there's one voice. Can I hear from a few others? Because this is an important point that's coming up. And so I also might inquire underneath, like, what's behind, I call that an oppose. So what's behind the oppose? So just curiosity. Like, I think when things go off the rails, they absolutely will. I think it's great when things go off the rails because it means people are willing to say what they're really thinking versus sit there politely and, follow along with what, you've suggested. So I think
I
it'll
want to
happen, and be curious.
Yeah, I want to spend a little bit more time on that because I
Mm,
think when people think, "Oh my gosh, my meeting has gone off the rails, I have to put more control on it." But I love what
yeah.
you're saying is I got more curious and
Mm,
I'm asking more questions and I'm pulling more voices in because something is hitting a vein.
yeah.
Instead of us saying like, "Okay, let's just close the topic, it's over." Let's figure out the vein. Like, where is
Mhm,
this going? Why are we going here? What is the untapped need that we are not tapping into? What is the thing underneath, right? There's a
yeah.
conversation happening underneath. There's that like undertone, right? That's actually really going on. Let's dig into that and figure out
Yeah.
what's really happening. There's what people are sensing, saying, right? But then
Mhm.
there's what they're thinking and what they're actually doing. And
Yes.
sometimes they can be saying one thing, but alarm bells, right, are going off and they're actually doing something different. So how do we, start to tease that out? And you kind of
Yeah.
started to lean into that a little bit, but
Mm,
I think this is it's a maturity in facilitation when it's no longer about, and I like what you said, because that is a facilitation skill of going and standing next to someone and
yeah.
then they be quiet, but you're not surfacing what
Mm-mm.
they're talking about.
Mm-mm. And years ago when I would do that, I was afraid. I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't know what they're going to say if I say, if I inquire. But that's the work that I've done on myself about how to stay when things get difficult, or how to
Mhm.
be curious when things get difficult. And Natalie, what I love about what you're saying is, we talked about the elephant, or the hidden agenda, or the invisible dynamics. I think anytime something goes off the rails, it is often because it's pointing to a bigger thing, and it's a little bit like following the thread, like
Yeah.
a detective. Sometimes I found, particularly if I'm an outside facilitator, I'm the safe person to
Mhm.
push back on.
Yeah.
So it's safe for people to make it about the process, or about me, or something that I've done. And so I often will hold that lens too, if somebody is really voicing something that feels like it's dissenters. So I think there's a curiosity there. And I know I would say to anybody getting started in facilitation, I totally get that is way easier said than done, but I think it's a practice. And I
Mhm.
wish that somebody had said it to me years ago.
I love that. Yeah, I love it because that is something I think that comes with time of even knowing how to handle that, like
Mm,
to not get into a place where you feel kind of, because that can happen. You can kind of feel
mm.
that fight or flight of
Yeah,
like, oh, I've got to
absolutely.
defend what we're doing here. I've got to defend how it's all going down versus saying, hey, I'm really curious.
Mm,
So and so is feeling this way. Are others feeling this way as well? Is this something that are you sensing this in your teams as well? Is this
yeah,
something bigger that we just haven't surfaced? Is this
yeah,
the elephant? Like, is
yeah.
this sitting below the surface and we're talking around it, we're dancing around it, but
Mm,
we just need to talk about it.
mm.
And we need to brainstorm about, well, what can we do? And I'm not saying we'll solve it here, but let's get it out. Let's get some ideas flowing. That's awesome. So I cannot believe our time has gone so fast because I feel like I'm like, we're just getting started.
Yeah.
But just give us some final thoughts that you have on facilitation. And again, I'm
Mm,
thinking about newer people that want to
mhm.
step out and begin to facilitate. What are some final thoughts that you would have for them?
I think picking one thing. I'm a big fan of not creating a backlog of personal, development to-dos. But I think picking one thing that you've heard in our conversation today, whether it's uh, being more mindful about planning before we meet, or thinking about design techniques and facilitation, or just thinking about how am I going to be neutral and step into that role. I'd say just pick one, and then start practicing it, and find someone that you can work with, whether it's in your org or someone externally that can also give you feedback about it. So I think that's how, facilitation is learned, by doing it and seeing the impact it has, noticing what happens, and then getting some aspect of feedback. So I just really want people to get started doing it somewhere.
I love that. And I love the just picking one thing. Like
Mm,
don't try to overdo it. Just find one thing that you can implement from what you heard us talk about today to
yeah.
start to impact the way that you show up. And I love that you talked about how facilitation is essentially
Mm,
is part of a big part of it is just how you're showing up and
yeah.
showing up curious, right? Versus showing up with the answer already
Yes.
solved and wanting
Yeah, and
everyone
that's
to
a
just
tough one.
yes. Yeah, because
Mm,
we come in there wanting people to agree, but we need to come in there,
yeah.
ready to solve the problem and be curious.
Yeah.
Marsha, tell us how to find you and how to follow you, and tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah. Probably the easiest way to connect with me is on LinkedIn, Marsha Acker, and you can find me on our podcast. So teamcatapult.com/podcast. I do a podcast called Defining Moments of Leadership, and it's all about storytelling of real leaders in the trenches. And I'm looking to bust the myth that leaders or leadership is something that is positional and that it is something that's perfect. So you hear stories about real people and the dips that have created new insights, new learning, new levels. So yeah, it's just trying to bust the myth of what is this leadership thing.
I love it. I love it. That's awesome. Well, please, please, please go check out Marsha, follow her podcast, follow her
Mhm.
on LinkedIn, and just get into a wealth of information that's inside her brain. I could have talked to you for like 2 or 3 more hours.
Same. I've thoroughly
Thank you
enjoyed the
for your time
conversation.
today.
Thanks, Natalie.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. And remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.